the night my son-in-law stood up from the dinner table and told my daughter to go sit in the car like she was a child being punished, and his father nodded slowly. Like this was perfectly reasonable. I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the front door. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I had spent 31 years as a family court paralegal in Halifax, and I had learned something in those years that most people never do. The moment you react, you lose. So I picked up my fork. I cut another piece of roast, and I began to plan. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 64 years old. I live in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and I have one daughter. Her name is Sylvie. She was born in late October during a storm that knocked the power out across half the county, and she came into the world so determined and so loud that the midwife laughed and said, "This one will give you trouble in the best possible way." She was right. Sylvie challenged everything. She was the child who asked why at the dinner table until her father ran out of answers. She was the teenager who organized a walkout at her high school when the administration canceled the Indigenous History elective without explanation. She was the young woman who graduated from Dalhousie with a degree in social work and immediately took a job at a family shelter in the North End. Because she said she wanted to do work that mattered before anything else mattered. Her father, my husband Edmund, used to say she had a compass in her chest instead of a heart. She always knew which direction was right, even when right was harder. We lost Edmund to pancreatic cancer 4 winters ago. It moved fast, the way it always does. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. Sylvie flew home from Vancouver, where she had been working at the time, and she did not leave. She stayed by his side until the very last breath. When it was over, she held my hand in the hospital hallway and did not say anything for a long time. She did not need to. I told myself the grief would pass through her the way it passed through me, slowly, messily, but eventually. What I did not account for was who would be standing nearby when she was most open and most raw. She met him 6 months after her father died. His name was Curtis. No, that was not his name. His name was Wesley. She met him at a fundraiser in Dartmouth, a community dinner organized to support a local food bank. He was there with colleagues from the development company he worked for, and Sylvie told me afterward that he had approached her across the room and said he recognized her from a profile piece in a local magazine about the shelter. He had read it, he said. He was impressed, he said. He believed in the work she was doing, he said. She brought him to meet me on a Sunday afternoon, in February, still cold, the harbor gray and flat behind my kitchen window. He shook my hand firmly. He complimented the house. He asked about Edmund, gently, respectfully. And when I told him a little about who my husband had been, Wesley nodded and said, "He sounds like the kind of man you don't come across often." Edmund would have seen through that sentence immediately. I only understood it later. The thing about charm at that level is that it scans as warmth. It asks the right questions. It remembers what you told it last time. It sends flowers after a difficult week, not because it read your feelings, but because it read your needs. Wesley was attentive to Sylvie in a way that looked, from the outside, like devotion. He showed up at the shelter when she worked late. He drove her to her grief counseling appointments without being asked. He said things like, "I just want to make sure you're okay. I don't want you carrying everything alone." I told myself he was good for her. I told myself she deserved this. I told myself that my instincts were colored by a mother's possessiveness and a widow's loneliness, and that I needed to trust my own daughter. They got engaged after 14 months together. The wedding was small, at a venue in Lunenburg that Sylvie had loved since she was a child, a converted fisherman's hall with wide plank floors and windows that looked straight out over the water. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She looked happy in a way I wanted to believe completely. What I did not know on her wedding day was that he had already begun. It starts so quietly that you almost miss it. Almost. The first thing I noticed was that Sylvie stopped bringing things up. She was a woman who had opinions about everything. City council decisions, nutrition labels, the way the CBC was covering Indigenous land rights. Suddenly, when we had dinner together, she waited for spaces in the conversation rather than filling them. When I asked what she thought about something, she looked at me with just a fraction of a pause before answering. Not long, but enough. I told myself she was tired. The shelter had been through a funding crisis that year. She was managing more cases than any two people should manage. I told myself exhaustion explained it. Then she stopped driving herself to my house. At first, Wesley would drop her off and pick her up, and I thought that was considerate. Then I noticed he stayed in the car each time, and each visit got shorter. Then she started taking the bus instead, when he needed the car for things she was vague about describing. Then the visits became phone calls. Then the phone calls became shorter. By the time I understood what was happening, it had already been happening for 2 years. He did not call it control. He called it budgeting. They were saving for a house, Sylvie explained, and it made sense for one of them to manage the finances while the other focused on the day-to-day. Since Wesley worked in development and had more experience with property and investment, it was logical for him to handle the joint account. Sylvie's paychecks were deposited into that account automatically. If she needed cash, she asked. She said this to me as if it were a reasonable arrangement. I did not say what I thought. I asked if she had access to the account herself, if she could view the balance. "Of course," she said quickly. "Of course I can. I just usually ask him because he tracks things better. I let it go. I should not have let it go." He had a way of framing every restriction as something she had agreed to. When she mentioned to me, in passing, that she had turned down a promotion at the shelter because the new role would have required occasional evening meetings, I asked why. Wesley felt it would put too much strain on their time together, she said. They had talked about it and agreed it wasn't the right moment. When I pointed out gently that Sylvie had been working toward that kind of leadership role for years, she said I didn't understand, that I was making it into something it wasn't, that she had made the choice herself, and she was comfortable with it. That word. Comfortable. She used it the way people use it when they have stopped expecting more than that. His father was a man named Reginald. His mother's name was Claudine. They lived in Moncton, and they came to Halifax for holidays and long weekends, with a regularity that felt, after a while, less like family affection and more like Overstusight. Claudine was small, carefully dressed, with a voice that always sounded like she was correcting you, even when she wasn't saying anything critical directly. She had a way of commenting on Sylvie's cooking, her housekeeping, her scheduling that stopped just short of outright insult. Close enough to sting, far enough to deny. When Sylvie told her she was thinking about going back to do her master's degree in social work, Claudine tilted her head and said, "That's a lot of time away from a marriage." And she said it sweetly. She said it the way you'd say, "Be careful about the weather." Reginald said less, but he watched everything. When Sylvie spoke, he would glance at Wesley. Not long, just enough to check. And Wesley would either nod or subtly shift the conversation. Sylvie didn't seem to notice. I noticed every time. The dinner in November, the dinner that changed everything, was supposed to be a birthday celebration. Sylvie's birthday falls on the 23rd, and I had booked a private room at a restaurant on the waterfront, one she had loved since she was a teenager. I invited her closest friend, a woman named Preethi, who had known Sylvie since university. I made sure the menu included things she loved. I wanted it to feel like the kind of evening that reminded her of herself. Wesley arrived with his parents, who had not been invited but had apparently assumed they were. I did not make a scene. I adjusted. Dinner began well enough. The food was good. Preethi was funny and warm, and drew Sylvie into conversation the way she always had. And for a little while I saw a version of my daughter I hadn't seen in too long, laughing freely, talking with her hands, leaning forward when she had something she wanted to say. It was like watching a window open in a room that had been closed for years. Then Sylvie said something. It was not provocative. She mentioned that she had been contacted by a legal aid organization in Halifax that wanted to partner with the shelter on a new program for women leaving unsafe housing situations. She was excited about it. It showed. Wesley set down his glass. He didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at her with a particular kind of stillness that I had started to recognize. Claudine adjusted something on the table. Reginald took a slow sip of his water. Then Wesley said, very calmly, we talked about this. Sylvie's voice shifted. Not by much, just enough that I caught it. We talked about exploring it, she said. I thought I could at least, he interrupted her, not loudly. You said you'd discuss it with me first. That's what you said. And then, while Preethi and I both held absolutely still, he reached across the table and took Sylvie's hand. It looked like affection. The way his thumb pressed down onto her knuckles did not look like affection. Sylvie looked at the table. I want you to go get some air, Wesley said. We'll be out in a moment. She went. She stood up from her own birthday dinner, at a table I had reserved for her, and she left. Preethi looked at me. Claudine picked up her menu as if nothing had happened. Reginald watched Wesley. I asked Wesley very quietly to excuse me for a moment. He nodded. He expected nothing from me. That was his mistake. I found Sylvie in the hallway near the coat room. She was standing with her arms crossed and her chin up, which was the posture she used when she was trying not to cry. Mom, she started. I said, don't. I'm not here to talk about what just happened. I put my hand on her face the way I had when she was a little girl. I said, I need you to listen to me and I need you to really hear me. Do you feel safe? She looked startled. Then she looked away, and in that turn of her face was every answer I needed. She went back to the table. I went back to the table. The evening ended with small talk and forced smiles, and Preethi catching my eye once with an expression that said she had seen everything too. That night, after Edmund passed, I had found his old journal in the drawer of his night table. He had written in it only occasionally. But there was a line near the end, when he knew what was coming, that I had thought about many times since. He wrote, the people who love us most sometimes need us to act on their behalf before they can act for themselves. Be ready. I had spent 4 years not being ready. I was ready now. I called Preethi the next morning. She had already been thinking, she said. She had noticed things over the past year that she had not known how to name. The way Sylvie checked her phone when Wesley called. The way she deflected questions about how things were at home. The one time, 8 months ago, that she had shown up at Preethi's apartment with a bruise on her forearm and a story about catching it on a cabinet door. And Preethi had believed her because Sylvie had believed it herself, or had needed to. That detail moved through me like ice water. I did not confront Wesley. I did not call Claudine. I had worked in family court long enough to know that confrontation, without documentation, without support structures in place, without a plan, does not help. Confrontation, in situations like this, frequently makes things worse for the person you are trying to protect. So I did what I had done for 3 decades for other people's families. I built a case. I spoke to a domestic violence advocate at a local organization who walked me through what I was describing and confirmed what I already knew. This was a pattern. Financial control, social isolation, the careful management of her professional opportunities, the physical coercion that announced itself in small ways. The bruise, the hand at dinner, the instruction to leave her own birthday table. The advocate helped me understand what resources Sylvie would need when she was ready. The key word, she told me, was when, not if. Most women leave. Most women find the moment. The role of the people around them is to make sure something solid is there to land on when they do. I talked to a friend I trusted, a retired social worker named Gail, who had spent 20 years in family services. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "You need to make sure Sylvie has a safety plan, even if she's not ready to use it, even if she doesn't know she has it." Over the next 3 months, carefully, I put things in place. I opened a separate bank account and began quietly setting money aside. I spoke to my lawyer about what Sylvie's options would be for separating from a marriage where finances had been consolidated. I learned, for the first time, about the provincial domestic violence legislation in Nova Scotia, that there were legal mechanisms available to her, emergency protection orders that could remove a partner from a shared home. I wrote everything down in a notebook I kept locked in my filing cabinet. Then I waited. Sylvie called me on a Tuesday evening in March. Her voice had something in it I had not heard in a long time. It was not distress exactly. It was clearer than distress. It was the voice of someone who has reached the end of something. He had gone through her phone, she told me. He had found her exchange with Preethi from weeks earlier, in which she had said something honest about feeling watched. He had shown her the messages with an expression she described as completely calm, which frightened her more than anger would have. He told her she had been disloyal. He told her she had no idea what he had sacrificed for her. He told her she would not be where she was without him, and that Preethi was filling her head with things that were going to destroy what they had built. Then he had gone to bed, and she had sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, and she had thought about her father. And she had thought about what Edmund used to say, about her compass, and for the first time in a very long time she had felt it again. Just faintly, just enough. "I need to come home," she said. She did not say for how long. She did not need to. I told her I would come and get her right now, tonight, if that was what she needed. She said, "No, I need to do it properly. I need to not be afraid." I said, "All right." I said, "I'm here whenever you're ready." I said, "I love you, and that's the only thing in this conversation that isn't going to change." She came 3 days later. She told Wesley she was going to her mother's for the weekend. She brought 2 bags. She brought the folder of documents she had quietly located over the previous weeks. Her passport, her social insurance card, her academic credentials, the folder of her personal tax returns from before the joint account. She had been preparing without telling me. She was her father's daughter in that way. Wesley did not let it go quietly. The messages started almost immediately. Some were apologetic. Some were threatening in language that stopped just short of explicit. He told mutual acquaintances that Sylvie was having a breakdown, that I was interfering, that their marriage was being destroyed by outside influence. Claudine called me once, controlled and cold, and told me I had overstepped. I told her very simply that my daughter was safe, that she was making her own decisions, and that I hoped Claudine would reflect carefully on the role she had played in this. Then I said goodbye and ended the call. What happened in the weeks and months after was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of smaller ones. The night Sylvie looked up the details of the Nova Scotia legal aid program herself and called them without asking me to do it for her. The morning she texted Preethi and made a plan to get together, and then actually went. The afternoon she called her supervisor at the shelter and said she wanted to revisit the conversation about the legal aid partnership if it was still on the table. It was. Her separation was handled through lawyers. Wesley contested the division of assets, and it took longer than it should have. But she had her own counsel, and she had copies of everything she needed, and the financial control he had exercised over their joint account actually worked in her favor when the picture was laid out clearly for the mediator. He did not fight for her, he fought to win. There is a difference, and anyone who has sat across a family court table from someone like that knows exactly what it looks like. The divorce was finalized on a gray afternoon in October, almost 2 years to the month, after she had walked out of that dinner with 2 bags and her documents. She called me from outside the courthouse, and she did not say much. She said, "It's done," I said. "I know." She said, "I'm going to go get a coffee and sit by the water for a bit." I said, "That sounds right," she said. "I'll call you later." She called me later. Is back in her own apartment now, in the north end of Halifax, close to the shelter where she works. She has a small balcony that looks out over a side street with an old maple tree that turns extraordinary in September. She planted things in pots out there this spring. Tomatoes, herbs, a climbing sweet pea that she was very proud of. She called me a few weeks ago on a Sunday morning, which is when we talk now, our Sunday morning call, the one we had lost for years and found again. She was making tea. I was doing the crossword. She told me she had been asked to present at a conference in Ottawa in the spring on financial coercion as a form of intimate partner abuse. She was going to say yes. I put down my pen. She said, "I think I want to talk about what happened to me, not just in general. I think there's something useful in saying it plainly." I said, "I think so too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a compass. I just couldn't find it for a while." I said, "I know." I waited. "You always came back to it," I told her. "I want to say something to anyone who is watching this and recognizing their own life in what I have described. I am 64 years old, and I have seen enough of the inside of family courts to know that what happened to my daughter is not unusual. It is not rare. It does not only happen to women who are vulnerable or uneducated or isolated. It happened to one of the most capable people I have ever known, and it happened precisely because someone identified her capability and worked patiently to dismantle it. If you are a mother or a father or a sibling or a friend who is watching someone you love become smaller, I want you to know that there are things you can do. You do not have to wait for a crisis. You build toward the moment they are ready, and you make sure there is something solid there when they arrive. If you are the person who is reading this because something in you recognizes the smallness, the monitoring, the slowly closing circle of who you are allowed to be, I want to tell you what my husband wrote in his journal. Near the end, when he still believed in what people could do for each other. He wrote that the people who love us most sometimes need to act on our behalf before we can act for ourselves. But he also wrote, just below that the most important actions are always our own. Sylvie found her way back to herself. It was hers to find. What city are you watching from tonight? And if this story found you where you needed it to, I hope you'll leave a comment below. Sometimes just saying I recognize this is enough to remind someone else that they are not alone in it.